Hello, this is Claudia, and for the next hour I'll be reading from the May 20th issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Ebola raged for weeks in Congo before anyone raised the alarm. Early surveillance and testing failed to identify the rare species of Ebola responsible for the current outbreak. An American doctor is among the confirmed cases. As soon as Ebola was identified in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Uganda late last week, the severity of the outbreak was clear. There were already hundreds of suspected cases and dozens of suspected deaths. Shortly after the outbreak was announced, the World Health Organization declared it a global health emergency. But by then, the virus had already been circulating for weeks. Congo has surveillance systems meant to identify outbreaks early so that they can be effectively contained. The country has added several laboratories in recent years and has extensive experience with previous devastating Ebola outbreaks. And yet, precious time was lost when officials in Ituri, the province at the heart of the current outbreak, did not raise the alarm when patients began to show symptoms. Samples may not have been sent quickly enough to Kinshasa, the capital, for testing. The alert was out very late, said Dr. Marie-Rosalind Belizaire, a doctor and epidemiologist who is leading the World Health Organization's response to the outbreak. Typically, high numbers of cases are picked up much earlier by health officials or in news reports. This time, it was weeks before health officials knew for certain that they were dealing with an Ebola outbreak. The consequences of such a long delay could prove catastrophic. There are no vaccines or treatments for Ebola Bundibugyo, the rare species of the virus that is responsible for the current outbreak, and tests that can be used in the field are hard to come by. And in Ituri, contact tracing is likely to be very difficult. There are large numbers of people who are displaced by conflict and many migrant laborers drawn to its gold mines. The previous outbreak in Ituri between 2018 and 2020 was the second deadliest Ebola outbreak ever. A lack of testing capacity was one reason for the delayed response, officials say. Equipment on the ground in Ituri only tests for the most common species of Ebola, known as Zaire, so early results keep coming back negative. When samples were finally sent to Kinshasa, officials there identified Ebola Bundibugyo. An American doctor, Peter Stafford, is among the confirmed cases. The Christian missionary organization he worked with, called Surge, confirmed he was exposed while treating patients at a hospital in Naikundi, southeast of Bunia. The latest suspected death toll, according to Congo's health ministry, stands at 105 in Ituri alone, a toll that climbs daily. Hundreds of suspected cases have been reported around the province, as well as one in Goma, another major city more than 200 miles away in eastern Congo, and two in Kampala, the capital of Uganda. 5 countries in the region have started screening travelers or tightening border controls, and Rwanda has closed its border with Congo. The outbreak was declared late, said Dr. Bill Kayench, a doctor working mostly in displaced people's camps for the Congolese nonprofit Grace, and who is involved in the Ebola response in Bunia. It should have been done nearly 30 days before, he said. He said that the epicenter of the epidemic, a gold mining town called Mangwalu, is almost impossible to access now in the rainy season. Several militias operate there, and because they often clash with each other and with the Congolese army, he said, most health authorities usually stay in Bunia, 30 miles south. This is how it happened that there were deaths with signs of Ebola in the community, he said, and the community and even healthcare personnel weren't aware of these signs. In April, one health worker in Mangwalu became sick, was taken to Bunia, and died there. Later, the body was taken back to Mangwalu. Dr. Konechi said that case was what pushed health workers to collect samples, he said, adding that some of the samples collected had been contaminated. Samples were collected in the last days of April in Aru, an area about 100 miles northeast of Bunia and close to the Ugandan border, according to Placide Mabala, the head of epidemiology and global health at Congo's National Institute of Biomedical Research. Those samples tested negative for Ebola in Bunia and later tested negative in Kinshasa as well. More samples collected between May 3rd and 7th in an area south of Bunia Wampara also tested negative in Bunia, but when the Wampara samples were tested in Kinshasa, they tested positive. Dr. Mumbala's team used a test designed for Ebola Sudan, another species that has caused 8 outbreaks in Uganda and Sudan, according to the World Health Organization. They were surprised to find results for the Bundibugyo species, not for Sudan, Dr. Mumbala said. It is not yet known when this outbreak started. Infected people have likely been traveling and attending funerals for at least a month. The World Health Organization said that many deaths have been reported, potentially associated with unsafe burial practices like washing, touching, and wrapping the deceased without protective measures. This has been out of control for weeks, clearly, said Atul Gawande, a former senior official at the United States Agency for International Development. Speed is everything. From when the first case happens is critical. He said that the Trump administration's closure of USAID has already impeded the response to the outbreak. The Director General of Congo's National Institute of Biomedical Research, Jean-Jacques Muyembe, told Congolese media that there were delays both in reporting the epidemic and technical delays in the diagnostic system. Our surveillance system didn't work, he said in an interview with a Congolese news website, adding that members of parliament and senators in the area who were aware of the deaths went on leave without raising the alarm. Dr. Muembe said that the laboratory in Bunia should have sent the samples directly to the institute as soon as the first signs of hemorrhagic fever appeared, according to the interview. Something went wrong there. That's why we found ourselves in this catastrophic situation, he said in the interview. The World Health Organization described a critical 4-week detection gap between the onset of symptoms of the presumed first case and the laboratory confirmation of the outbreak. This suggests healthcare workers had a low clinical index of suspicion, it said in a summary of the situation, adding that they may have confused it with other illnesses. 4 healthcare workers died within 4 days at Mangwalu General Referral Hospital, the WHO said. Dr. Belizari, the leader of the WHO response, said that there were problems of mistrust in the authorities, which may also go some way to explain why the surveillance system didn't pick up the outbreak until many people had already died. In the community, maybe they didn't share the information, she said. They didn't go to the health center. Jean Cassia, the head of Africa's Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, said he was in panic mode over the outbreak. People are dying. I don't have medicines. I don't have vaccines, he told the Associated Press. Ebola Bundibugyo has a mortality rate of up to 50%, Congo's health minister told journalists on Sunday, urging the sick to seek treatment. There have only been 2 other outbreaks of it. The first killed 42 people in western Uganda in 2007, and the second in the Congo in 2012 killed 29. Prison to pardons to payouts, January 6th rioters are elated at Trump's $1.8 billion fund. The possibility that people who ransacked the Capitol could get money from the government they attacked is the latest head-spinning twist in President Trump's effort to rewrite the history of January 6th. Anthony Vo was at a friend's house on Monday morning when a fellow pardoned January 6th rioter sent a message. The Trump administration had just created a fund to benefit people who believed that they had been wronged by the federal government, including those like him who had stormed the Capitol 5 years ago. Mr. Vo, who briefly fled the country to avoid his prison sentence stemming from the riot, said he did not know at first that the fund had come about as part of a larger deal by President Trump to withdraw an extraordinary lawsuit filed against the Internal Revenue Service. But the origins of the fund, he said, were less important than how it made him feel, surprised, relieved, and grateful all at once. I'm glad it turned into something, he explained, that could help people who had been hurting for quite a while now. That reaction, it turns out, appeared typical among the so-called January Sixers, who have long joined Mr. Trump in claiming that the efforts to hold them accountable for disrupting the peaceful transfer of power after the 2020 election amounted to mistreatment by the criminal justice system. Some felt that the fund validated their self-image as victims of the government. Others felt elated, albeit somewhat stunned, at the prospect of a payout. And not a few felt a bit confused at how the process of filing claims and receiving checks could play out. So many questions, said Enrique Tarrio, the leader of the far-right Proud Boys, who was sentenced to 22 years on a seditious conspiracy conviction arising from the riot. But it's good direction. The formal decision of whether to offer restitution to the rioters had been kicking around the Justice Department for months, delayed by internal wrangling. But in some sense, it had appeared inevitable that the Trump administration would ultimately funnel money to those who joined the mob on January 6th, given the president's relentless efforts to whitewash the events of that day. In one of the first official acts of his second term, Mr. Trump issued a sweeping proclamation that granted pardons to or dismissed the charges against all of the nearly 1,600 people indicted in connection with January 6th. He then began an aggressive purge of the federal agents and prosecutors who were handed the task of building criminal cases against the people who took part in the attack. The possibility that people who ransacked the Capitol, smashing windows and fighting with the police, could get money from the same federal government they attacked was that latest head-spinning twist in the effort to rewrite the history of January 6th. At a congressional hearing on Tuesday, Todd Blanche, the acting attorney general, did not rule out violent rioters receiving payouts from the fund. It has not been lost on many January 6ers that by deeming them worthy of reparations, the most powerful officials in the country have effectively validated their claims of having been wronged by the federal government, claims that in many instances were roundly rejected by the judges of both parties who oversaw their cases. This is the United States Department of Justice acknowledging the possibility that Americans were targeted through political abuse of government power. Tommy Tatum, a Mississippi man who was charged with civil disorder for interfering with the police on January 6th, wrote on Monday in a post on social media. That is historic. In a typical Trumpian move, the president has both played down his knowledge of the fund and praised it as necessary, telling reporters that while he did not know much about the proposal, it was put in place to reimburse people that were horribly treated. These were people that were weaponized and really treated brutally by a system that was so corrupt, with corrupt people running it, he said. The fund has spawned wide blowback, including criticism from some Republicans. Critics have said the real corruption comes from Mr. Trump and the Justice Department, which hashed out details of the fund in a deal that was never filed to the federal judge who oversaw the suit against the IRS. At the same time, experts on far-right extremism have raised concerns that giving money to people who stormed the Capitol, especially to those who assaulted the police, would only bolster political violence. It proves that extremism pays, literally said Amy Spittelnick, the chief executive of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, a nonprofit group that seeks to counter anti-Semitism and extremism. Over the last decade, we've seen this trajectory of conspiracy theories on the fringes moving to the mainstream and being normalized because of Trump and other elected leaders. Now, Ms. Spittelnick added, they're not just being normalized, they're actually being encouraged by financial incentives. At this early stage, many pardoned rioters have only started to muse on how they might spend a government payout. Among the ideas being kicked around, new cars, new houses, paying to get their names off Google, and underwriting political campaigns. The rioters are not, of course, the only people who could file claims to the so-called anti-weaponization fund. The deal that laid out how it would work specifically mentioned others who might seek payouts, including abortion protesters who face prosecution during the Biden administration and organizations targeted by the IRS based on improper ideological criteria. There is, in fact, a long list of people in Mr. Trump's orbit who have claimed that they were wronged by federal investigations or prosecutions. Stephen K. Bannon, Mr. Trump's one-time political advisor, was jailed for 4 months after being found guilty of contempt of Congress for ignoring a subpoena from the House subcommittee that investigated January 6th. The Justice Department has moved to drop his case. Peter Navarro, the president's former trade advisor, served a similar prison term on similar criminal charges. Then there are the dozens of Trump aides and allies, including many serving in the current administration, who were witnesses in the 2 federal cases filed against Mr. Trump by the special counsel Jack Smith. The cases, which separately accused Mr. Trump of seeking to overturn the 2020 election and of mishandling classified materials, wound up being dismissed after he won re-election, but those who were interviewed or appeared before grand juries were forced to spend significant sums on legal fees. Appearing at the Senate hearing on Tuesday, Mr. Blanche suggested that several Republican lawmakers whose telephone records were seized by Mr. Smith in 2023 might receive money from the fund. Even some of Mr. Trump's political opponents have cheekily suggested that they might enter claims as well on the theory that the president had weaponized the Justice Department against them. On Monday, for example, James B. Comey, the former FBI director, who had been indicted twice since Mr. Trump re-entered office, appeared on CNN saying that, who knew, he might ask the fund for money. It's to compensate people who have been targeted by the Justice Department for, they say, personal, political, or ideological reasons, Mr. Comey said, so I'm guessing I'll be in line. For the moment, the fund has been capped at the patriotically symbolic sum of $1.776 billion, and many January 6ers have already done the math in an effort to determine the maximum amount that each of them could get. If all of them sought money and received the same amount, the payouts would be around $1.125 million each. But that they are painfully aware assumes no one else will file a claim. We've been trampled on so much. I think finally we feel like we're getting a little something and maybe we're relieved, said Daniel Christman, one of the rioters, but this is a chump change. Even when Trump divorced Marla Maples and he was getting interviewed on it, he admitted that $1 million isn't a lot of money. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. With Trump's deal, a possible $100 million IRS penalty melts away. The tax service argued that the Trump organization tried to claim the same losses twice. The president said the audit was a disgrace. A tax audit that President Trump has been fighting since his peak earning days as a television celebrity was most likely wiped away in this week's agreement with the Justice and Treasury Departments. The agreement, part of a resolution to an unusual lawsuit that Mr. Trump and his sons filed against the Internal Revenue Service, frees the president from a potential adverse ruling that could have cost him more than $100 million, according to an analysis of his tax returns in 2020 by the New York Times. 2 years ago, Mr. Trump's middle son, Eric Trump, acknowledged to the Times that the audit remained active. During his father's first term in office, the matter was put on hold, records obtained by the Times showed. It is unclear whether the matter was placed on hold again during the president's current term or was resolved. If it was still pending until this week, the increased interest and penalties would have grown significantly. Mr. Trump has always argued that he did nothing wrong in the way he filed his tax returns. The audit dated back to the $72.9 million tax refund that Mr. Trump claimed and received starting in about 2010. The total reflected all the federal income tax he had paid plus interest. For 2005 through 2008, his greatest earning years as a star of his reality show, The Apprentice, Mr. Trump justified the refund, claiming by declaring huge business losses, a total of $1.4 billion from his core businesses for 2008 and 2009, that tax laws had prevented him from using in prior years, the Times previously reported. Records obtained by the Times did not itemize the business losses, but two of the largest scale projects of Mr. Trump's career, his long-failing casinos and his money-losing tower in Chicago, appeared to be behind the biggest numbers. In both cases, Mr. Trump made the argument that his interest in those projects met the tax code definition of worthlessness. In 2008, with sales on his new Chicago condo hotel tower lagging far behind projections, Mr. Trump claimed that he had so much debt on the project that he would never see a profit. That move resulted in Mr. Trump reporting losses as high as $650 million for the year, the Times and the ProPublica found. The IRS has argued that he, in effect, tried to write off the same losses on the Chicago tower twice. In 2009, the Trump casinos were headed toward another bankruptcy. After the casino bondholders rebuffed Mr. Trump's offer to buy them out, he notified the Securities and Exchange Commission that he had determined that his partnership interests are worthless and lack potential to regain value, and was hereby abandoning his stake. That notice used the exact precise wording of what tax laws refer to as abandonment, which opened the door to Mr. Trump suddenly declaring all the losses on the business that he had not been allowed to use in prior years. Those findings by the Times and ProPublica resulted from the leak of Trump tax information, over which the president, as well as two of his sons, sued the IRS for $10 billion, accusing the agency of not doing enough to prevent the disclosures. The IRS has successfully fought similar lawsuits brought by others. The agreement to end the Trump's lawsuit while sidestepping judicial review also puts an end to any other audit by the IRS pertaining to tax returns they or their businesses have already filed. That is another potential benefit of an quantifiable amount, given that neither the IRS nor the Trumps have divulged whether more recent issues have been raised. IRS procedures call for the mandatory audit of the president's tax returns annually. Asked whether audits related to those issues or others remained active when the agreement was reached, the White House referred the question to the Trump Organization. A response from a spokesperson there did not address those questions. The ongoing audit became a regular feature of Mr. Trump's first campaign for president. He regularly cited an audit as the basis for refusing to release his tax returns, a departure from the tradition that most major party candidates have upheld for decades to reveal potential conflicts of interest. During his failed 2020 re-election campaign, Mr. Trump seemed quite agitated about the continuing audit. "It's a disgrace what's happened," he told Sean Hannity of Fox News. "We had a deal done. In fact, it was signed even. And once I ran or once I won, or somewhere back a long time ago, everything was like, well, let's start all over again. It's a disgrace." In 2024, Eric Trump, who has run the family business since his father entered politics, struck a similar note in response to questions from the Times. "This matter was settled years ago, only to be brought back to life once my father ran for office." Days after hosting Trump, Xi deepens ties with Putin. China's leader, Xi Jinping, called for a halt to fighting in the Middle East, ignored Russia's war in Ukraine, and took a veiled swipe at the United States. Less than a week after holding talks with President Trump, China's top leader, Xi Jinping, met with President Vladimir Putin of Russia in Beijing on Wednesday, casting the two countries' relationship as a stabilizing force in a world thrown into tumult by the United States. "The tide of unilateral hegemony is running rampant," Mr. Xi said to Mr. Putin. According to a Chinese state media, it was an oblique reference to the United States, which this year launched a war in Iran and violently seized the leader of Venezuela. Speaking to Mr. Putin inside the Great Hall of the People, Mr. Xi called for a complete cessation of hostilities in the Middle East, warning that it would be unacceptable if fighting renewed. The Trump administration has been considering relaunching strikes, which had been paused since a ceasefire was announced last month to force Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Mr. Xi acknowledged the pain the crisis is inflicting on China, which relies on the strategic waterway for about 40% of its oil imports. There is also growing concern that Iran's ongoing shutdown of the strait could devastate global trade, the chief engine of China's economy. An early end to the conflict would help reduce disruptions to energy supply stability, the smooth operation of industrial and supply chains, and international trade order, Mr. Xi said. The two countries were eager to show that they had enhanced ties. Mr. Xi hailed a new phase of more active engagement and faster development between the two countries. Mr. Putin was equally effusive and opened his remarks to Mr. Xi, whom he had again called "my dear friend," with a Chinese proverb expressing longing. "One day apart feels like 3 autumns." The Russian leader also signaled that his relationship with Mr. Xi remained close, noting that they constantly seek to coordinate our positions. He cast the two countries as equals working together to forge a more just and democratic world order. "A difficult process of shaping a polycentric world based on a balance of interests of all countries is underway," Mr. Putin said, likely referring to what he argues is the erosion of the U.S. global dominance. But beneath that show of solidarity lies an uneven relationship. Russia has become increasingly dependent on China since launching an invasion of Ukraine 4 years ago that has turned into a costly stalemate as Russian soldiers struggle to gain ground and the country's economy falters. Russia also relies heavily on China for dual-use technologies, civilian capabilities that can be applied to the battlefield. Mr. Putin will want to ensure that China maintains that supply. At the same time, the oil shortage caused by the war in Iran has only enhanced Russia's position as an energy supplier to China. Mr. Putin stressed that Russia remains a reliable supplier of resources amid the Middle East crisis, while China acts as a responsible consumer of these resources. Mr. Putin, who was traveling with Russian energy executives, has been urging China for years to agree to open another major gas pipeline between the two countries. Known as Power of Siberia 2, the pipeline would link Siberian extraction sites with northwest China Through Mongolia, Beijing is concerned the pipeline would make China too dependent on one nation for energy supplies. The project has been stalled amid disputes over key details, including how much China will pay for gas. No agreement was signed on the proposed pipeline on Wednesday. Dmitry S. Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, said that some nuances still need to be agreed upon. The two countries did sign more than 40 documents, according to the Kremlin, the highlight of which seemed to be a joint declaration on the emergence of a multipolar world and a new type of international relations. That document was heavy on lofty rhetoric, laying out a vision of a post-U.S.-led war order that promises nations more equality and mutual respect, even as those stated ideals clash sharply with Moscow's invasion of Ukraine and Beijing's aggressive muscle flexing across Asia. Mr. Putin seemed to offer a glimpse of how he might want that world to look. Speaking to a Chinese engineer whom he had met during his first visit to China in 2000, Mr. Putin told him, "We are ready to cooperate with all partners around the world, including the United States. We discussed this with President Xi today." The remark hinted at a vision in which Washington, Beijing, and Moscow operate as great equal powers managing the world among themselves, rather than one in which the United States dominates the rest. The recent interactions among the three major powers have indeed raised the possibility that the cooperation between China and Russia could provide some new space for the involvement of the United States, said Chang Jin, a professor at the Russian Studies Center of the East China Normal University. The construction of a multipolar world does not necessarily exclude the United States. What it rejects is specific hegemonic behaviors, he said. Yuri Yushakov, Mr. Putin's foreign policy aide, said that Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump might meet in the Chinese city of Sichuan in November, presumably on the sidelines of a regional economic forum. Mr. Yushakov also said that Russia was expecting Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, Mr. Trump's special envoys, for peace talks in Russia in the coming weeks. Indeed, even as Mr. Xi deepens ties with Mr. Putin, he has invested heavily in courting Mr. Trump, whose tariffs, technology restrictions, and support for Taiwan can hurt Beijing's interests. The Chinese reception of both Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin reflected the balancing act Mr. Xi is striking. Mr. Putin's red carpet welcome was similar to Mr. Trump's, featuring an honor guard inspection, a 21-gun salute, and a group of cheering children. While Mr. Trump had been greeted at the airport by Han Zheng, China's vice president, Mr. Putin was met by China's top diplomat, Wang Yi. Yun Sun, director of the China program at the Stimson Center in Washington, said that in her view, Mr. Han was the more senior official, but Mr. Wang played a more active role in foreign policy. During last week's summit with Mr. Trump, Mr. Xi was friendly despite the frequent tensions between the United States and China. Mr. Xi took Mr. Trump inside the secretive Chinese leadership compound in Beijing, known as Zhangnahai, on Friday, and seemed to signal that he was being granted rare access. Mr. Trump asked Mr. Xi if he had hosted other world leaders there. "Very rarely," Mr. Xi said. "For example, Putin has been here." You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Bond yields hit highest level since 2007 as inflation fears set in. The 30-year U.S. Treasury yield hasn't been this high since the lead up to the global financial crisis. Across Europe and Asia, yields are also elevated. Bond markets convulsed on Tuesday, pushing the rates on U.S. Treasuries to levels not seen since the global financial crisis nearly 20 years ago, as investors grew increasingly anxious about rising inflation because of the war in Iran. The yield on the 30-year Treasury note rose to 5.18% on Tuesday, its highest level since 2007. Bond yields move inversely to prices. The rising rates, which are pushing up borrowing costs for governments, homeowners, and businesses, could be a critical pressure point for the Trump administration as it continues to pursue its campaign against Iran, which has pushed up oil prices worldwide. The last time President Trump faced such turmoil in the Treasury market was after he announced in April last year that he would raise tariffs on nearly every U.S. trading partner. The steepening rates were cited as a primary reason that Mr. Trump later backed down from many of his most draconian proposals. This time, investors across the world are becoming increasingly concerned about the fallout from the months-long conflict in the Middle East, where, despite a ceasefire between the United States and Iran, efforts to find a lasting peace deal have stalled. The yields on 30-year bonds in Canada, Germany, France, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and Switzerland all traded at their 12-month high on Tuesday. Across the rest of Europe and Asia, the long yield was also elevated. In Britain, the tumult in the government bond market is even more extreme. A leadership crisis facing Prime Minister Keir Starmer has helped push the country's 30-year bond to its highest level since 1998. Japan's 30-year bond yield sits at 4.13%, the highest it has ever been, as rising energy prices strain the country's already struggling economy. Bond investors around the world are focused on the continued blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, the vital shipping lane that before the war had funneled roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply, predominantly to Asia and some parts of Europe. In the United States, the impact of higher oil prices was reflected in a series of inflation reports last week showing consumer and producer prices both rising at their fastest pace in several years. Another factor weighing on the Treasury market is last weekend's summit between Mr. Trump and China's leader, Xi Jinping. Investors' hopes that much anticipated meeting would result in China's help with ending the war in Iran were dashed. In Europe, world leaders met on Tuesday to discuss ways to temper inflation, though many in the group were upset about a U.S. decision this week to further ease sanctions on Russian seaborne oil in an attempt to bring down global fuel costs. Some European officials said the move rewarded Russia while its aggression in Ukraine continued. I think there is just a lot of fear out there right now, and a collective hesitancy to step in front of the sell-off, said Vail Hartman, a U.S. rates strategist at BMO Capital Markets, noting concerns that yields could continue to move higher. Unlike during last year's tariff turmoil, Mr. Trump appears less willing to back down over Iran, analysts say. The economy is otherwise in good shape, underpinned by the growth of artificial intelligence and blockbuster corporate profits. The stock market has risen for 7 consecutive weeks, hitting record highs along the way. But the rising rates are also starting to add pressure on stocks. On Tuesday, the S&P 500 fell about 0.7%, its third consecutive daily drop as investors awaited developments in the tenuous ceasefire in the Iran war. When asked on Tuesday how long Iran had to return to the negotiating table, Mr. Trump said 2 or 3 days, maybe Friday, Saturday, Sunday, maybe early next week, a limited period of time. The climbing Treasury yields could complicate Mr. Trump's other economic priorities, like jump-starting the stalled housing market. The 10-year Treasury yield, which underpins borrowing costs for mortgages, has also surged higher since the start of the war with Iran. That yield has risen roughly 0.75 of a percentage point since the war began to a 4.67%, its highest level since the start of 2025. The average 30-year mortgage rate has risen to 6.36% from below 6% before the war, according to data from the housing agency Freddie Mac. Some of the increasing Treasury yields are driven by anticipation that the Fed will potentially need to raise the short-dated interest rates it controls to try to slow inflation. These expectations are increasing even with the appointment of the new Fed chair, Kevin Warsh, whom Mr. Trump picked with hopes of lowering rates. Before the war began, investors had expected the Fed to cut rates at least 0.5 percentage point by January. Now they have lowered those expectations to a 1/4 point rise based on prices in interest rate futures markets. There is a feeling that this is going to get worse before it gets better, said Joseph Pertel, a portfolio manager at Neuberger Berman, adding that the market is pricing in some kind of premium for that uncertainty. Deputy British Ambassador to U.S. leaves job abruptly. James Roscoe, a diplomat who previously worked for the royal family and at the United Nations, left his role without an immediate explanation. Britain's Deputy Ambassador to the United States, James Roscoe, has left his job, the British government said on Wednesday, without offering any further details. In a statement of just 6 words, giving no indication of the reason for his abrupt departure, Britain's Foreign Office said simply, James Roscoe has left his post. Mr. Roscoe's official biography on the British government website was updated on Wednesday morning to say that his role as deputy head of mission in Washington ended this month. Mr. Roscoe's departure is the latest rupture at the embassy, which was thrust into the spotlight when the former ambassador Peter Mandelson was fired last September. Mr. Mandelson was ousted after revelations about the extent of his links to the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Mr. Roscoe was acting ambassador for several months after Mr. Mandelson lost his job last year, and he was seen as a potential successor. However, the post went to another senior official, Christian Turner. Mr. Roscoe played a significant role in organizing President Trump's state visit to Britain last year and in the recent return trip made by King Charles III to the United States. Before moving to Washington, Mr. Roscoe was Britain's ambassador to the United Nations General Assembly, and before that he worked as a communications director for 2 British government departments and as communications secretary to Queen Elizabeth II. Early in his career, he was a chief press officer in Downing Street under the governments of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Harvard caps A's as selective colleges attack grade inflation. Faculty members overwhelmingly approved a limit on the number of top grades they can give to about a fifth of their undergraduate classes. Faculty members at Harvard University voted in recent days to cap the number of top grades they are permitted to award to undergraduate students in an attempt to reduce grade inflation at one of America's most prestigious colleges. The plan, which was approved by the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, has announced on Wednesday, will limit A's to 20% of the letter grades awarded in a course, with an allowance for as many as 4 additional A's. That means that in a course with 100 students, for example, a professor would be permitted to award up to 24 A's. There is no limit on grades of A- or lower, and the cap applies only to undergraduates. The vote was 458 in favor, 201 against. This is a consequential vote, Amanda Claybaugh, the Dean of Undergraduate Education, said in a statement. It will, I believe, strengthen the academic culture of Harvard. It will also, I hope, encourage other institutions to confront similar questions with the same level of rigor and courage. Grades at Harvard have been creeping upward for decades. In the 2024-25 school year, about 2/3 of the undergraduate letter grades were A's, a distinction that is supposed to be reserved for extraordinary work, according to the student handbook. A little over a decade earlier, in 2012-13, just 35% of Harvard letter grades were A's. Grade inflation is a national problem that experts say reduces the value of grades. If most students get an A, grades become less valuable to employers, graduate school admissions officers, and the students themselves as measures of their subject mastery. San Diego attack follows alarm about rising Islamophobia. Muslims pointed to a rise in overt hatred online, political attacks, and harassment in the months before the killing of 3 people outside an Islamic center. The young men who killed 3 people outside a San Diego mosque complex this week had expressed hatred for all types of people, inspired by vitriol and conspiracy theories they found online, law enforcement officials said, but it was Muslims they chose to target. So, to some, the killings seem like an inevitable result of a swell of Islamic phobia in the United States and around the globe. Anti-Muslim rhetoric on the right has become louder, with the Republican politicians raising concerns about new Muslim schools and growing Muslim communities, and at the most extreme suggesting Muslims don't belong here. Muslima Permel, age 43, whose children attended school on the mosque campus, said her 12-year-old son was feeling gloomy, angry, and sad. Then he said something that really hurt us, Miss Parmul said, her voice breaking. He said, "I feel unwanted." Miss Parmul, a longtime member of the community who knew all 3 of the shooting victims, said that her son had gone on to observe, if this were to happen to anyone else, everyone would make a much bigger deal about it. Hatred against Muslims is a long-standing problem, but the escalating conflict between Arabs and Jews in the Middle East, the war in Iran, and the reverberations of both throughout American politics have ushered in a new phase of overt discrimination and fears of violence. Politicians like Representative Randy Fine of Florida have enthusiastically embraced Islamophobia, saying it is rational and more of it is needed. President Trump himself has a history of criticizing Muslims and Islam, and has recently posted about the war in Iran in inflammatory terms, including a message on Easter in which he promised that a whole civilization will die. In another message he signed off, "Praise be to Allah." This week, Laura Loomer, an advisor to President Trump, suggested on social media that all Muslims should be deported and called them an invasive species. Her remarks showed how mainstream Islamophobia had become, said Nader Hashimi, the director of the Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown. There used to be fringe movements, people who were at the margins of society, he said. Now Laura Loomer has direct access to the White House. He added, so no surprise then that these things get internalized by people who then commit these acts of violence. Abigail Jackson, a White House spokeswoman, said that the Trump administration had repeatedly condemned political violence and that the Democrats were smearing their opponents as Nazis, fascists, and more. Imam Taha Hussein, the director of the mosque, said that it had been steadily adding security features in recent years, including a tall metal fence and cameras. Looking at what's happening, the madness of this world and the dehumanization of the Muslim community, you do expect something like this, he said. The Council on American-Islamic Relations received more civil rights complaints last year than it had recorded in any year since 1996, according to its most recent report. The Islamophobia Index, a measure of the public's endorsement of negative stereotypes, rose from 2018 to 2025 with a marked increase between 2022 and 2025. The index was created by the Institute for Social Understanding, which provides research and education about American Muslims. Earlier this month, a congressional subcommittee held a hearing on the dangers of the rise of Sharia law in America. Sharia law is a term for Islamic religious rules. There has been a corresponding rise in anti-Semitism and violent episodes targeting Jews. That trend has drawn bipartisan concern, and denouncing anti-Semitism has become a cause for many on the right, even as others embrace or ignore white nationalists espousing anti-Semitic views. Some Muslims say that by contrast, the discrimination they face has been met with complacency or worse. Even as Muslim Americans have won more visibility and political power in parts of the United States, there has been increased vitriol against them. The campaign and election of Zohran Mamdani, the first Muslim mayor of New York City, was accompanied by millions of negative social media posts and commentary from public officials that called Mr. Mamdani, among other things, a terrorist, a jihadi, and a supporter of Sharia law. In late January, Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, one of the two Muslim women serving in Congress, was attacked by a man with a syringe. On college campuses, Muslims have expressed worries about discrimination and harassment, documented in several extensive reports commissioned in the aftermath of the protests over the war in Gaza. At Harvard, Muslim students told school investigators that physical assaults, online harassment, and the publishing of their photos and personal information had created an atmosphere of intimidation at the school, according to the 2025 report of the university's task force on anti-Muslim bias. A similar task force at the University of California, Los Angeles, warned that President Trump's return to power had emboldened off-campus vigilantes as well as repressive faculty on our campus to step up their harassment of those speaking about or teaching Palestine. Many students who spoke to the Harvard task force said that the school had not done enough to protect students, while the UCLA task force accused the school's chancellor, Julio Frenk, of prioritizing the work of a parallel committee to combat anti-Semitism. The asymmetry of your response to the two task forces is glaring, members of the group that focused on anti-Muslim sentiments wrote to Dr. Frenk in March 2025. The university recently announced steps to combat anti-Semitism, and this week, a university spokesperson said that UCLA had taken concrete action to address all forms of hate and to cultivate a campus grounded in mutual respect and safety. Muslim leaders and advocacy groups had also found themselves increasingly accused of supporting terrorism, a trope that gained potency after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. At the time, some Islamic groups came under intense scrutiny over their interactions with those who had planned and carried out the attack. Two of the 9/11 hijackers had posed as recently arrived foreign students and had sought to help with issues like finding housing at the Islamic Center in San Diego, the same mosque where Monday's shooting took place, according to the 9/11 Commission report. The report called their mosque acquaintances well-meaning and found no evidence that the key mosque member who helped them had known of their hijackers' plans. On Monday, Ms. Loomer brought up the connection seeking to tie the mosque complex to the 9/11 terror plot and citing its leaders more recent defense of Palestinian violence against Israel. In Texas, where Republicans are increasingly warning of incursions by radical Islam, Governor Greg Abbott has labeled CAIR, one of the nation's largest Muslim rights groups, a terror organization. In a statement this week following the shooting, CAIR's director Nihad Awad called on public figures not to fuel hatred and division that inevitably inspires acts of violence. There is a stereotypical trope that there's something unique about Islam and Muslims that produces violence unlike any other religious tradition, Dr. Hashimi said. It's dangerous. It's factually unsustainable. It is a gross distortion. Mr. Hashimi recalled that in the days following 9/11, President George W. Bush visited a mosque and drew a line between Islam and terrorism in what became known as his Islam is Peace speech. Muslims love America just as much as I do, Mr. Bush concluded. The speech was widely viewed as calming anti-Islamic violence and sentiment. By contrast, Mr. Hashimi said current leaders have displayed an adversarial, combative attitude toward Muslims. President Trump himself has called Somali Americans, a predominantly Muslim community, garbage. Still on Tuesday, Vice President J.D. Vance condemned the attacks, noting that he and his wife have often visited the neighborhood around the mosque on trips to San Diego. I don't know a single person who would say anything other than what I'm about to say, which is that type of violence in the United States of America is reprehensible, he said, and I encourage every single American to pray for everybody who was involved and affected by it. We don't want that to happen in our country. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Broadway's Giant with John Lithgow turns a profit in 10 weeks. The fast success of this play about the children's author Roald Dahl is a rarity on Broadway when most shows lose money. Giant, a Broadway play starring John Lithgow as Roald Dahl, the popular children's author who expressed anti-Semitic views while criticizing Israel, is now officially a hit. The play's producer, most of them leading a Broadway production for the first time, announced on Tuesday that the play has now recouped its $5.6 million in capitalization costs. That means the producers can repay investors the money they put up to finance the show and can start earning and distributing profits. The show, which focuses on remarks Dahl made while criticizing Israel, made back its money in just 10 weeks with only 7 performances a week for most of those weeks. Most shows that recoup take longer to do so, and do so with 8 performances a week. Giant is playing 8 performances a week for the remainder of its run. During the week that ended on May 10th, Giant outgrossed every other new play and new musical that opened this season. Its average ticket price was $175. The fact that this show was able to commercially viable is incredibly encouraging to us. As new producers of storytelling, said Dana Lee, one of the lead producers, art doesn't have to be easy. It doesn't have to be wrapped up in a bow. It can leave people lingering. Giant, written by Mark Rosenblatt, takes place in England on a single afternoon in 1983 and imagines a confrontation between Dahl, the renowned author of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, James and the Giant Peach, and Matilda and his American publisher, worried about how Dahl's incendiary comments might affect sales of his books. The play, directed by Nicholas Hytner, was first staged at the Royal Court Theatre in London in 2024 and then transferred for a successful commercial run in London's West End in 2025. The Broadway production, which opened at the Music Box Theatre in March to positive reviews, is produced by Brian and Dana Lee, Stephanie Kramer, and Nicole Kramer, and Josh Fieldler and Robin Goodman. It is running until June 28. The fact that we have a 16-week run creates a theatrical event with a sense of urgency around it, said Nicole Kramer, and given the topic of the play, the buzz we had from London, and our strategic pricing, we were able to maximize all of that for our Broadway run. The show has been nominated for 4 Tony Awards, including for Best Play, as well as Lithgow's performance, Hytner's direction, and a featured performance by Aya Cash. The Best Play race is quite competitive. The other nominees include Liberation, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama, as well as The Balusters and Little Bear Ridge Road. Giant is the only new play of the current Broadway season to recoup its capitalization costs, at least thus far. But 3 of this season's play revivals have also done so. Art, $6.75 million, Waiting for Godot, $7.5 million, and Every Brilliant Thing, $5.75 million. None of the current season's musicals have reported turning a profit yet. The producers of Giant announced last week that they plan to screen a live capture of the London production at movie theaters around the world this fall. In Musk versus OpenAI, the real winner was the suit. It was the one thing on which every major player could agree. When it comes to Musk versus Altman, the verdict is in the Oakland, California trial in which Elon Musk accused Sam Altman and OpenAI of stealing the nonprofit in order to enrich themselves. That they accused him of sour grapes, the jury decided that Musk had waited too long to file his suit. The statute of limitations meant it was null and void. Still, both sides came out of the 3-week exercise in name-calling tarnished. The real question raised by the trial, can these people really be trusted with a technology set to disrupt everyone's world, possibly forever, wasn't answered. But as tech watchers and investors pick apart the implications, one surprise winner has emerged. The suit itself, not the lawsuit, the suit. After decades of being dismissed as a relic of the old world by the inventors of the new, a shackle meant to be shrugged off by the visionaries of the future who needed to free themselves from the jacket and tie to think their big thoughts, the importance of the suit was the one thing on which almost everyone seemingly agreed, at least judging from what they wore to court. Musk, who testified first at the trial, set the tone in a black suit and matching tie rather than his usual t-shirt, jeans, and aviator jacket. Greg Brockman, the president of OpenAI, wore a navy suit and blue tie instead of his typical sweater and pants. Satya Nadella, the chief executive of Microsoft, also showed up in a dark suit and glossy tie, not his usual blazer and open collar shirt. Then there was Altman himself watching with his legal team, and on the stand he was not in the gray sweater and jeans that he recently told the New Yorker he wore every day to lessen his decision fatigue and maybe to associate himself with Steve Jobs, the famous uniform wearer, but in his own series of navy and gray suits and blue ties. There were nuances between the choices, to be sure. Musk's dark, loud, mean, and memes sneaked in via his Reservoir Dogs chic. Altman leaned more blue sky, choir boy, Nadella and Brockman more banker serious. But overall, the suits were a statement unto themselves, no matter who was actually talking. It was as dramatic as an image change, as if every member of the Congress suddenly showed up for the State of the Union in hiking shorts and a fleece. Sure, the protagonists were dressing to show respect to the court, but they were also dressing to manage a bigger message, which has to do with the broader shift in the relationship of the tech world to the watching world. Despite their supposed rejection of the old dress codes in order to let their brains run free in the fields of the binary, the technorati have always understood the symbolic role clothes play in conveying their agenda. They know how effective their refusal to adopt both pre-existing outfits and pre-existing professional assumptions was in building their myth. That's how hoodies and Tevas became synonymous with the digital frontier. That's about face in the courtroom isn't chance, it's strategy. Tech going from Patagonia to Brioni is a symbol of its rising importance, said Venki Ganesan, a partner at the investment firm Menlo Ventures. It's a transition from move fast and break things to stability and responsibility so that you can trust us with the future of mankind. It's a transition from upstart and angel investing to giant public company that has to woo Wall Street. SpaceX has filed for an IPO planned for June. OpenAI may soon follow. A suit, after all, is the garment of the manager and the executive. It is the uniform of authority and tradition, of Washington, Wall Street, and the institution. It plays by the old sartorial rules and taps into long-held cultural associations with adulthood, aspiration, and success. It is not coincidentally the preferred outfit of the president, who many of these companies are currently wooing. It comes complete with a familiar value system, practically worn into the seams, especially suits from Brioni and Catan, the Italian brands Ganesan said had become the most popular in Silicon Valley, and which were once the uniforms of the great industrialists of the past. As the underbelly of the technological revolution is exposed in trials like this one, and as tech executives are called to testify before Congress to defend and explain their choices, covering oneself in the costumes of duty and accountability can serve as a quiet counterpoint. The tie draws a line somewhere deep in the subconscious between the current reality and satires like The Audacity, the new AMC show in which the morally unhinged characters have equally unbuttoned up wardrobes. This is especially important at a time when fear of AI is rising, with twice as many Americans feeling pessimistic as optimistic about the technology, according to a recent Economist YouGov poll, and as graduates boo commencement speakers who talk up the machine learning future. And even though the trial is now over, the costuming is likely to continue. And not just because Musk has vowed to appeal, or because of his social media addiction cases moving through the court systems in other states. Tech spent years positioning itself culturally outside systems, Washington, courtrooms, congressional hearings, that are still deeply encoded with the semiotics of traditional executive authority, said Joseph Rosenfeld, an executive image consultant who works with clients on the West and East Coast. Now, many of these tech leaders operate directly inside those systems. Clothing naturally shifts with that change in relationship to power. In other words, while crew necks and three-quarter zips are probably not entirely going away, the era of the Silicon Valley suit may also be upon us.